thanks guys for coming on. I appreciate it. We got some new guests. Conan's on. He was in. If you want to find out more about him, he's in episode 55. I've already interviewed him. He just newly awarded his PhD, so we got to call him Dr. Higgins now. He made us do it. I mean, I didn't want to do it, but he said so we got to do it.
Actually, not true.
Ow.
Not true.
Yeah, all right, Doc. And then we have Joel here. Joel, you and I know we just went over it offline, but now that we're recording, can you give everybody kind of a background on who you are and what you do and what you're doing right now as far as your dissertation and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so thanks for having me on. I am a TACP by trade. Went through the Schoolhouse Hockade 8 back in 2011. Came in the sort of newly minted 13 Lima program back then. Did a stint with 3ID and First Cav. And then also kind of during my time in the Air Force, I found sort of a way to get into grad school. And while I was in grad school doing an MA about 10 years ago, I started to kind of uncover some narratives about the social history of TACPs in Vietnam. Really found that to be an incredibly engaging and very powerful narrative. And obviously very excited to talk about that. And unfortunately, couldn't really do as much as I wanted to do it with it at the time until the Air Force sent me back to grad school. So I'm here up at the University of Wisconsin doing a PhD in history and researching TACPs in Vietnam.
Nice.
So happy to be here.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming on. It's something people may recognize Joel from that new TACP documentary that's out right now. Now, I don't know, is it called Controlled? Is it called, what's it called? I know the first, the have you guys seen it? Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen the whole thing, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So it's called something different on YouTube, and there's a different name card on it. So Joel, maybe you can speak to that. What do we, if we're telling people what to look for, what do we call it? What do we call the documentary? Or Ethan, go ahead.
I can tell you, yeah, as Joel and I were involved in the pre-production, and Joel, of course, did a fantastic job and should be the face of the interviews there for that one. But and all the pre-production stuff we did for that, we decided very early on we were not going to use the term "cleared hot" for anything in this documentary. I just wanted to get that out of the way. That term has been abused.
But anyway, there's the. Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. You were about to jump in and say something. I was
well,
just following up with
whatever
you
it's called, there's a TACP documentary out there, and it's phenomenal. And the Black Rifle did a great job on it. Joel, you're in it. You give a phenomenal explanation of the history of TACP. You and Nate really kind of tag team that one, and it was great. It was awesome. I was playing it at work, and everybody at work was kind of really fascinated by it. So I wanted people to know that, hey, if Joel looks familiar, he's the guy on the new TACP documentary, which is awesome. So check it out. It's on YouTube. I posted some links to it, so it's everywhere. Just and if you want to find out how to locate it, let me know, or get on Black Rifle's webpage, and it should be a link there. So that being said, let's dive in. Last time we left off at we left off at Korea, and we were going to dive into Vietnam. And I said, well, let's wait a minute, because we were already like over an hour the last time. So, and I know Vietnam was going to be like a big portion of this conversation. So, and thankfully, Joel, you're able to make it, because you are, of us, probably the most knowledgeable about TACPs in Vietnam. So if you want to kick it off and maybe give a little background about, hold on, Steve, go ahead.
Just a quick question. I don't remember. Did we do any bridging between Korea and before, or pre-Vietnam?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think we ended up in Korea, and then I think we're going to go into Vietnam. So yeah, Steve, if you want to kind of bridge that gap a little bit, feel free.
Well, if you want, I'll do just a quick bridging, because I can say basically, rinse and repeat. The same thing we did in 1945, we did again in 1953. I could talk more about the cultural dimension. My dissertation was how, and this was at the height of the air power advocates trying to make everything strategic bombing. The fighter pilots are still trying to get recognition, and so nobody wants to talk about CAS. Sure enough, when there were some obviously some action before Johnson decides to send in the combat units in 1965, but still they were very very low level, and the U.S. military establishment was definitely not ready for the kind of the scope and the quantity of CAS operations and TACP personnel that were going to be needed once we started sending over large combat units, and the numbers quickly ran up into the hundreds of thousands. So, I guess anybody else have anything else to throw in there before?
Well, let me ask you a question
Joel?
real quick. You mentioned the biggest thing that stood out to me in Korea was that we were not prepared. Like we didn't learn any lessons from World War II.
Right.
We tried to reinvent the wheel. It didn't work. Did any of those lessons carry over? I know we were kind of alluded to it before about how we really kind of learned from it, but talk to me about that. Talk to me about and Joel, please jump in here.
Sure thing.
Oh, anybody, but Joel, especially for the TACP history, but like what was our attitude towards CAS going into Vietnam?
Well, I think it was very much like the period between World War II and the outbreak of Korea. We could ask Nate if he comes back, if he managed to make it here for some of this, because he might have picked up some. But everything that I've read, and like I said, I did quite a bit of the popular culture background. And like I said, I don't know as I even ever heard the topic of CAS mentioned. There were a couple of obscure Hollywood movies that might have, but still, the whole point is that, as near as I'm able to recall, 1965, we are learning it all over again. And it really is sad to think that, but I can't recall anything that was unless it was an individual saying, "Well, my granddaddy told me about WW2 and that sort of thing." But no, institutional, and again, Nate might have more of the documentary, the training manuals and the official doctrinal literature might have carried over, but still, in terms of personnel, there really was not much carried over at all.
Yeah, and can I jump in there too and add a couple things here too? So I mean, I think worth noting that the Air Force at the time, it's kind of this repeating narrative over and over and over again of unrealized potential, right? It's sort of the mentality of the Air Force as we're kind of processing through this particular period, right? So I think there's always kind of this continual ambition to try and figure out a bigger and better way to do its business. It's not necessarily like this malicious track that the Air Force is going on and trying to sort of like negate some of these lessons learned, as much as it is recognizing that within the scope of the warfare that we think that we're going to go and engage in, this is where we see air power playing some of the biggest roles, right? And so, I mean, and this is not, a unique thing to the Air Force at the time, right? Like it's worth mentioning that the Army during this same period is really reckoning with the same degree of problem. And they come up with this whole scheme of what, like, they called it pentomic warfare, right? I mean, this is atomic warfare to the max, where we're assuming that entire, brigades and, divisions are going to get wiped out with nuclear weapons. And how do we keep them mobile? And, how do we sort of, keep them enough on the move where essentially they can't be targeted, right? So everybody's trying to kind of figure out what this sort of Cold War era warfare is really, really going to look like, and so the Air Force, the cultural impact of that on the Air Force then is to divert its attention towards the 10,000-pound gorilla, right? Which is assuming that's going to be the Russians or the Soviets crossing across the Fold Gap, right? So I think in some regard they look at CAS as absolutely an emergency option, something that we can pull out of our back pocket should we ever need to do that again, but by and large we want to actually try and figure out a way where where we're not all going to die in this giant nuclear fight that's going to happen. And so the Air Force, like, as it's making all of these moves, it's transitioning TAC, towards, what it's sort of affectionately called like SAC Light, right? I mean, it's a subsidiary of Strategic Air Command in the sense that it's still, some nuclear capability employed on aircraft, or at least that's the way that the R&D is kind of trending, enough to where it's really becoming kind of another, strategic targeting, strategic bombing kind of organization, not something that's designed to do this sort of low-level conflict. And so I think in recognizing that the Air Force is not necessarily learning its lesson, it's probably important to note that it's trying to learn a very significant sort of anticipatory lesson at the same time that's really obscuring the need to focus on close air support, right? So just sort of, I guess, a caveat, like, as we're moving into this Vietnam period.
Joel, I really like the way you put that, because TAC really is having to try and pick up some of the crumbs dropping off the SAC table, and
Yep.
I think it's pertinent to where we're going to go. I'm assuming when we get talking about Vietnam, one of the biggest illustrations of the TAC is not thinking about the kind of needs we're gonna needs we're gonna have when we start doing CAS again. They're not thinking about that at all. Instead, what they're building are supersonic interceptors, supersonic fighters, the Century series, and of course, one thing I think everybody related to CAS once Vietnam emerges is that the Century series are about the worst CAS platforms, and it's it's just aeronautics 101 why they don't work in the CAS environment.
Yeah, and worthwhile mentioning, just as a sort of another little tidbit in the conversation, I think we're talking about like aircraft, like research and development, right? Is the Army has bit hard into this helicopter program, and have you guys talked about this already in the last go round?
Okay, no, we have not talked about that. We have not talked about anything Vietnam yet. So if you want to dive in, please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so worthwhile mentioning, right, that in the background behind all of this stuff, right, behind all of these, sort of lessons learned post Korea, moving into the Vietnam period, is that the Army is recognizing that part of it is its desire for mobility, its desire for it's the ability to control a lot of its own assets, right. It prefers to move organically, which makes sense, right? And also the idea that it wants to really have control over its own fire support assets. It's really biting hard into this helicopter program. I think Korea kind of makes a degree of, well, it's a little bit tantalizing, right? I think we realize that the potential for helicopters is really there. And so it really starts researching into this concept and actually makes some pretty significant forays into that new kind of piece of tech and trying to, I think, really sort of set the stage. Which, I mean, like, if you think about sort of the classic Army experience in Vietnam, right? I mean, like the Huey over top of the treetops, right? Like, that's it. That doesn't happen without the Army's heavy focus on helicopters pre-Vietnam. And a lot of that is built out of a major contest between the Air Force and the Army about who's going to kind of control these assets. Because they're airborne, should the Air Force have ultimate responsibility for these things, or should the Army have responsibility for them? Can we consider them to still be organic because of their, flight profile, because of their particular, mission design? All of those things kind of make sense in some degree to kind of keep them with the Army. But the Air Force is really kind of frustrated about this in some regard. And Steve, I mean, you pointed me to this years ago, actually, the great sort of narrative about the duel between the Air Force, between LeMay and the Army Chief of Staff at the time, right? The real classic kind of Air Force Army rivalry experience going on. I think they're in the Pentagon. And, they're having this debate about the merits of helicopters versus, fixed wing fighters. And, LeMay challenges the Chief Staff of the Army to to a duel where one flies in a fixed wing fighter, the other one flies in a helicopter, and they're going to try and shoot each other because there was that much animosity about this particular debate. So I mean, it's highly contested moving into the period. Now, of course, the Army does win out, right? They do receive those organic assets with the understanding that the Air Force still is going to provide close air support should it ever really be required, that the Air Force is going to maintain control of the system that supports that particular mission set, and that, the Army is somewhat more restricted on what it can do in terms of employment of gunships, right? So if you got a lot of firepower in the sky, that falls more within the realm of the Air Force's sort of purview. Now, if you're doing things like air mobile related things, obviously that ends up being within the Army's camp. So we kind of end up with this very convoluted division of labor, right, about who's going to own this type of stuff moving into this Vietnam period.
Nice. Hey, do you want to shift a little bit and kind of? I know that. Well, maybe you can tell me. Were the ROMADs and the ALOs, were they there at the very beginning, or was that something that kind of that progressed as the war went on? Or
Joel, before you answer that, I want to go back to what you just said about the way they kind of divided who got what out of the last little spat, right? And one of the things that you said, and I'll paraphrase, is that the Air Force would maintain control over the delivery systems, right, and the program.
Yep.
Is that a fair approximation of what you said?
Yep.
Okay, so in that, are you telling me that, or do you know? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I am. Is that where it started? To where even today, the Army has their what do they call them in the Army? Are they JTACs too? I mean, I don't know. They were
JTACs now, yeah.
Yeah, but they have to still follow our qualifications in terms of currencies and things. Correct? It's still an Air Force program, Air Force controlled, right?
Yeah.
So I think that might be interesting if that's actually where they divided the spoils, so to speak. Because I was in when 1965 or so, and here we are 60 years later, and that's still kind of the defining rule of who does what.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's just a comment on that. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a gradual progression, right? I mean, so I think there's elements of this that really occurred during World War II, really kind of during the the original setup with TACs, kind of about whether it's going to be the Army Air Forces or whether it's going to be the Army proper that's going to kind of manage different sections of this, and it gets a little further developed in Korea with kind of the original true ROMAD system, that they didn't call them ROMADs, but I mean that stems from Korea, and Korea is kind of a little bit of an anomaly, right? Because the original organization of this particular system had ROMADs actually falling in with the Army, right? So they were supposed to be staffed by the Army. And I was just verifying some notes a little bit before we started here. And, a month and a half into the war, when this, system is essentially sort of set up, at least the way that it's going to endure for the next 3 years, there's 7 Army ROMADs that are, in existence, right? It just simply wasn't a priority for the Army. And so the Air Force starts staffing this system and starts jamming people into the mix, basically to try and make the system function, right? I mean, they provided the ALOs, they provided the facts, but they needed these other mechanics, they needed these other, Jeep drivers, radio operators to basically allow the system to function in the way that it did. And so there's a little bit of an impromptu and informal kind of handoff there during Korea that happens, that I think it sort of sets the stage again for this sort of more formal handoff heading into Vietnam. And so I would say, I mean, to answer your question, if you had to draw a firm line on it and say this is where the formal agreement happens, specifically with ROMADs, yes. If we're talking about if we want to include in there ALOs and facts in the whole system, I would say that probably has antecedents back to World War II.
If I could jump in here, there's a very interesting element to the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, which I'm sure most of you know was the first really big battle of the Vietnam War. And Hal Moore talks about the dependence he had on his ALO who was an Air Force pilot, and particularly the one episode that sticks out the most is they had a very unfortunate fratricide element in that one of the aircraft coming in under the ALO's control ends up dropping short, and it falls right on the headquarters element. And Hal Moore turns, I believe he was a captain. Hal Moore turns to the captain, who's the ALO, and says, "Shake it off and keep them coming." So, what I think this says is that in the very first major battle, we had ALOs in the system. They were pilots from the Air Force. They had already established a working relationship with the Army commander. So, yeah, I think there was in the background, wasn't getting enough emphasis, but there was a skeletal arrangement that could be fleshed out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to just continue on, Joel, from there and just kind of bring us into the Vietnam and just kind of talk about the history behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. And how much do you want me to cover? I mean, the conflict itself, right? I think there's some sort of like probably some important kind of macro elements that are worthwhile mentioning, but I don't want to trend down that road because it will really divert heavily from, I think, talking about like TACPs in
the
general.
day after Dien Bien Phu and the French left until the final flight.
Right.
If you could keep it between those, you're probably good.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any guidance, JD, on?
Yeah, I mean,
anything
just
you want me to-
don't get too far in the weeds, I guess.
I think big macro elements of Vietnam, right? Like, important kind of mechanisms that are really kind of essential to this, narrative, right? Is, obviously, as Conan just mentioned, there's a precursor to this conflict that's pretty significant. Without kind of going into a ton of detail on that one, major battles between the French and the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese obviously come out on top and kind of really are able to declare independence out of that. As a byproduct of that and some post-World War II arrangements, Vietnam ends up being very divided right along the 17th parallel. And so, part of the agreement there is really that, the United States is going to assume a degree of management for what is South Vietnam. And aspects of that really kind of come out with who we decide to back and also our kind of place in the world at the time, right? So, I mean, 1954 here, things in Korea have just happened. China has just gone communist, right? There's a real fear that, that we're literally watching the dominoes play out. And domino theory is being exercised as it was originally kind of conceived, and the commies are essentially kind of taking over, right? So for us, this sort of leads to this, like, these backed into a corner kind of decisions, as we're assuming global responsibility for the Cold War, at least on the sort of the Western side, or the side of democracy. And so this really kind of leads us to be kind of engaged Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the premier of South Vietnam, and who ends up kind of not really being the best of characters, right? So hindsight being 2020, Diem is he's hardcore into nepotism. He's disengaged from his populace. And this really leads to somewhat of a social crisis in Vietnam, right? So the preconditions that are setting up this conflict for what it is, right, for this major counterinsurgency, are those types of things. We're in the midst of a global Cold War. Diem is sparking, the seeds of social revolution and social discontent on South Vietnamese soil, and Ho Chi Minh is reforming up in North Vietnam, at the cost significantly of a number of North Vietnamese lives, right? So it's a pretty brutal reform period, but a lot of things are kind of moving. Where this really kind of puts us pre-1965 is that we're actually already very much engaged. We already have advisors on the ground. We're already conducting, air campaigns. Our desire to sort of build up the South Vietnamese military is absolutely present, and we've sort of like trickled into Vietnam. I mean, it's an epitome of kind of mission creep, right? How this happens. I mean, you can go back and you can look at a lot of the narratives, the Pentagon Papers, comments from McNamara, comments from JFK and Johnson. And it looks like, there's absolutely an awareness that this is a very ugly conflict that we're really trying to stay out of. And by and by, we sort of slowly start kind of creeping into this, partially really out of kind of a sense of responsibility, right? As things kind of start to expand, and the conflict starts getting more and more violent, we realize that we've made commitments that now to uphold them means that we're going to have to sort of commit even further. And it's this dynamic that basically draws us into Vietnam. So 1965 happens, or I should say the Gulf of Tonkin incident happens, and that ultimately is really the trigger that pulled us into the conflict itself. Now, when that occurs and we actually really start putting troops on the ground, I think it's like absolutely critical to note that air power is like the convenient option, right? It is mesmerizing in its ability to, achieve kind of like, strike targets at decisive ranges. We're coming out of a period where it looks like air power, certainly had these massive impacts on our ability to achieve a kind of a decisive victory in World War II, has very strategic impacts on Korea. Obviously, there's some nuance there. But point being, though, is it's a very attractive option without major troop commitments to basically start aggressively messaging the North Vietnamese and saying, like, hey, this conflict needs to kind of go according to these particular rules. We don't want you down here anymore. You need to let democracy kind of run its course south of the 17th. And so air power becomes this like very strategic way of messaging. And part of that is happening through, the use of, campaigns like Rolling Thunder, bombing to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, basically trying to restrict North Vietnam's ability to penetrate into South Vietnam, and also make sure that they are like strongly messaging Ho Chi Minh and the rest of the Communist Party up there that this is not how this conflict is going to go kind of in the future. In the midst of that, right, and this is where all the cast stuff really starts to kind of come into play, is that we're trying to sort of compile together a strategy. And there's a great book out there by Greg Daddis called Westmoreland's War, that's really kind of a reassessment of Westmoreland's strategy in the war itself. And I mean, like, I think it presents this kind of compelling argument that we don't have a lot of great options about how we want this war to go. There's a couple different strategies. There's kind of this idea about like, hey, we can kind of create these like peaceful pockets that will slowly kind of expand. There's more robust pacification campaigns. There's all kinds of different ideas. But sort of over top of all of this are these major limitations that have been put into place by, the presidential administration at the time, which was Johnson. And this is part of like where, H.R. McMaster goes in his book about, dereliction of duty, that there's so much political control, so much political restraint over top of this conflict that it's becoming hard to prosecute, right? We don't want to go into North Vietnam. You can't conduct an outright invasion of them to destroy these sanctuaries where the Viet Cong are hiding or where the NVA are hiding, and we've got to kind of limit ourselves to air power engagements. So Westmoreland is very restricted, right, in terms of what he can do. And so there's a degree of like, well, you kind of got to just make the best of what you got, and which is what, effectively he essentially does, which is, by and large kind of maintain a degree of security, try and fight for the initiative when you can, and then use this sort of air mobile concept to, shuffle army troops basically to, try and seize terrain temporarily from the Viet Cong or the NVA, and then knock out a lot of the supply caches and stuff. So it is and in fact, it's kind of a very developed kind of strategy. Just the problem is it's not necessarily that effective over time. Now that we have the benefit of hindsight, being 2020. So what's interesting is about how kind of CAS and close air support really plays into this. And you could look at the numbers, and it's pretty wild, actually, when you think about how much emphasis is really placed on strategic bombing, but how much actually was, in terms of air power employment, was pushed towards close air support. And I mean, it's massive, right? I think it's like 70% of the missions that are flown are close air support missions, over the course of the entire war, right? So underneath the surface, as the Army's trying to maintain its strategy and maintain the initiative against the North Vietnamese, there's this whole system underneath where they're trying to prosecute kind of these low-level targets. And this is the thing that, to go back to what we were saying before, that like the Air Force is just not well prepared for this type of stuff. And they're not, right? We've totally thrown our coins in with, strategic bombing, these sort of super fast interceptors. And so we don't have the R&D that's been done to deploy aircraft to the field in this particular capacity, unless we start begging and borrowing and stealing from other people, which is essentially what we do, right? So we start flying, O1s and O2s, which are essentially off the shelf. One of the more effective CAS platforms out there was the A1, which is, designed to be a Navy plane, right? So the Air Force is not necessarily sort of geared towards doing this particular style of conflict, unless it's pulling off the shelf from other people. Yeah, Steve. Sorry, and I'm long-winded here, so please cut me off.
Just to tie into something we've already mentioned here and there through some of these, that the big thing, probably the linchpin of how CAS will develop after Vietnam is the emergence of the ROMAD. The enlisted guy who is, for all intents and purposes, they are the ones who carry all the corporate knowledge into the future. And here's one of the reasons why, because the Air Force was so unprepared, and yet, as and Nate's said this too, that you look at the numbers, and the majority of the air sorties that are conducted in Vietnam are CAS sorties. So the Air Force isn't ready. We're flying all these CAS sorties. Who is going to be controlling them? There aren't enough pilots to send out to be ALOs, and so invariably the enlisted guy who's maintaining the Jeep, who's operating the radios, he's got to pick up the mic and help carry the load. And I think that is right there one of the sort of catalysts that comes out of this. The Air Force wasn't ready, and yet CAS is going to, by necessity, do a major job. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's such a critical point to understand, Steve. And like, thank you for bringing that up. Because I mean, I at the core of it, a lot of this really kind of comes down to just like simple arithmetic with manpower, right? The Air Force just does not have the capacity at the time to start diverting all of its pilots into these field roles, And so this patchwork system that it's put together essentially to run, close air support is not staffed effectively and robustly enough, I think, to maintain the ops tempo that is required during these particular phases of the conflict. And so this is where you start to see these ROMADs kind of take over. And the ROMADs, by and large, I mean, this is the fascinating part of the story, right? I mean, like, these guys are coming from unexpected places, to be honest, and they're showing up in 1965. They are, they're there right at the inception of the conflict itself. And, they're showing up, by and large, completely untrained, right? Like, the most that these guys have ever fired a gun is in basic training. And some of them, not even that, right? Some of these guys joined the Air Force to avoid service with the Army. And a lot of other ones were kind of like walking in with expectations that they were going to kind of absorb kind of a normal quality of life that the Air Force offers. That these guys were not going to go be combat troops in Vietnam, and so they start getting off the plane, and then all of a sudden they start getting fragged out to all of these other units in Vietnam. And when they show up there, I mean, it's like them, and if they're lucky, a FAC that's assigned alongside of them, and it's their responsibility as a team to basically facilitate this system that provides close air support to the Army. Now, when these guys go out on missions, obviously, the FAC's going to be flying, right, as he should. That's really where you want him to be, right? Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to get close air support. So who's out there on the ground? Who's out there driving all the Jeeps? Who's there running the radios? It's the ROMAD, right? These are the guys that are actually out there interfacing with the Army on a day-to-day basis. Now, that's not to say that FACs or the ALOs don't do that extensively as well. They do. There's just not simply enough of them to really kind of cover all the bases. And so, as you look at a lot of the manning documents from all the tactical air support squadrons in Vietnam, that are assigned up and down the country, you can look and you can see there's a couple officers. Those are the guys that are flying the airplanes. And at best, I think like in country, there was about 250 of them there at a time. But who's the one that's actually doing a lot of the work with the Army? It's the people that have the capacity to be able to do that. And that's the ROMADs, because those ones were actually, they had a little bit more of a complement of them, right? As opposed to, I think, a major manpower shortage in the FAC domain. With the ROMADs, there's actually, we do have them. And so they're the ones that kind of create that, I think, more functional relationship with the Army. So, and I mean, like, it's fascinating, right? I mean, I was talking to some of them the other day as I was doing an oral history interview, and, he's talking about, being I can't even remember, an E3, and he was, he was all chummy with the regimental commander. A lot of the troops that were around him were sort of flabbergasted by this, here's this high ranking Army officer that's highly dependent on this young Air Force enlisted guy, right? It's just absolutely incredible. And again, to reinforce, they were not trained for that. Their background is in radio maintenance and radio operations, not, the full complement of planning joint operations with a sister service. It's pretty wild ultimately. So yeah, I think your point, it's a manpower question that really kind of drives a lot of this type of stuff.
Which is funny because now we're running into another manpower problem, and we ran into a manpower problem prior to the GWAT, and it just seems, and I always say this on this podcast, it seems like that thing is so cyclical that they're like, okay, we need these JTACs, we need this close air support now. All right, the conflict's over. All right, we don't need that stuff. Well, we will never need it again. So let's just draw down everything. Let's get, and then lo and behold, the next conflict arises, and then you need them again. So it's so odd. And like we talk about it a lot on here, that the CAS mission is going to be one of the only missions that'll probably be in every conflict. You may, have counter air, you may have some air interdiction going off, but you're always going to be supporting ground troops in a land war. So I don't know. It just seems odd that we always forget that every single conflict.
Well, just very quick, the serendipitous consequence of the manpower. Sir, I'm done.
You fold my words in half, and just to get them in. Hey, no, I was going to talk about, because you're talking about how this is seemingly crazy. Okay, it clearly worked. Then we forget about it between the wars, and et cetera, et cetera. But Vietnam's where we saw the F4 fielded without a gun, right? Because it's all going to be tech now. It's all going to be missiles for air to air, and right. So I mean, I don't. I'm not saying that to disparage the military, but we were all in it, so we know that they're not hiring a lot of the top brass from the Mensa conventions, right? So my whole point is there are people who actually thought it was a good idea and got it sold, right? Because that's why it became F4 with no gun. That's why it became, as you're saying, we lose that institutional memory of, holy crap, this worked. Why are we getting rid of it again? Usually it's cost.
Yeah, there's a great irony with the Vietnam War. It's a fairly well told story. So we've mentioned the F-4, right? Aircraft field without a gun. I'm also going to point to the F-111 Aardvark, also known as the Thunderhawk or the Thud. Every aircraft that was put into play, Joel, you had mentioned the O-1 and the O-2 aircraft, which were sort of purpose modified for the role of close air support, which, as you said, 70% of the sorties flown for the duration of that war were close air support. But for the preponderance of assets that were forced upon the services, whether it's Air Force or the Navy, when we're talking about fixed wing aircraft, every single one of them as a corporate forced program of record were multi-role. The F-4 was not designed to be an air interceptor, although that was its primary role. It was intended to be a multi-role Air Force and Navy fighter bomber jet. The F-111, as Conan, as you mentioned, was supposed to be this culmination of technology where we're never going to dogfight. We're going to throw missiles beyond the horizon, right? Because this is every aircraft in the Vietnam era was intended to be multi-role. So we never even had an asset that was dedicated to this mission that populated 70% of the requests sent in. That just, it makes what Romance achieved in Vietnam, as we're talking about these junior enlisted who are now interfacing with regimental commanders, it makes their achievements that much more impressive because they don't even have the operational and theater level tools to do their job. They're taking these corporate programs that are just good ideas from people that got hired to be policymakers and said, here's your multi-role aircraft. It does everything. That one doesn't have a gun, by the way. I love pointing out that story. It charms and chills my heart.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Conan says that, like, I think there is something to be said about the intelligence level, maybe, but it's also just the selfishness and personal agendas of these guys, and that, especially Vietnam. I mean, that thing went on for so long. The way they were not allowing our guys to do what they needed to do to win the war, like you were saying, not going to North Vietnam, not do the things we needed to
by
do.
Johnson, right? The White House had to approve your target list, so it's not real responsive in combat.
Mm-hmm.
It just seemed really like they're, and we've also discussed this many times. It always seems like the people making the decisions are not interested in the victory aspect of it, but more like, how's this going to affect things later on, or how can I get something out of it, or it doesn't. It's like if they really cared about their troops on the ground and them winning the war, they would just be like, go guys, go do what you need to do, because we don't need their help once we're there. We know what to do. To your point, Conan, I don't need to call the president to say, hey, can I go into this village.
I like the fact that JD said that they care about their troops with a straight face. I thought that was
well, that's what I'm saying. It's like
pretty
like they say they do, but it's like, do you really? I mean, it's obvious. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Everyone here was in the military. What do you think? Quick canvas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
So they try new tactics, they try new gear, they try all kinds of stuff throughout the ages. And Vietnam was the same way. Hey, we don't know if this is going to work. Let's try it.
Right.
That was equipment. That was tactics. That was jobs and everything. So it's I mean, you got maybe that whole area in time was just a big test bed, and what works, what doesn't. I don't know, but they have to cut something, and they wanted to cut the non-sexy stuff, which is radio operators, maintainers, and drivers.
Yeah.
I think also, we've touched on sort of the overarching Air Force mentality. I think it's also important to keep in mind, especially with these, the services conception of the fight that we got. And one of the most incisive critiques of the Army's mentality in Vietnam is their mentality of going into Vietnam was Patton racing across northern France in 1944. They could never shake that fundamental conception of, well, if we could beat the Wehrmacht, we should have no trouble with these pajama-clad Viet Cong, and yet, just like the Air Force cannot shake its, we can solve everything with strategic bombing. The Army has got an institutional blind spot as well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, this is where, I mean, on a big, giant macro level, and this is probably not discussion that we want to get into today, but just to throw this out there, that I think this is where ideas about like ways of war really kind of come into the conversation, right? About sort of, I mean, these are like cultural ways that we like to engage in combat. I mean, there's Russell Weigley makes that great argument about like kind of the, the goal of absolute kind of domination being like the American way of war itself, right? That's the kind of conflict that we're really gravitated towards, provided that it's an option. And I think, the Air Force has a way of war, the Army has a way of war, and it's culturally learned, right? Learned via trial and error, and some of these lessons are hard fought to absorb, and we have been very powerfully impacted by those sweet moments of victory that have been achieved by the desired method, right? I mean, the same kind of concept exists with Warden's application of air power during Desert Storm, right? There's sort of a desire to lean back towards that particular type of conflict, right? And so, yeah, I mean, Steve, you're absolutely right. Like Vietnam just does not fit that mold, but there is this thought that, yeah, of course we can win, no problem, right? These are peasants, obviously proven otherwise.
Well, there's some other great irony to, well, maybe not irony, but this will sound strange to people of Joel's and my generation who grew up in that later GWAT era. For us, everything was joint. The war was joint. Doctrine was joint. We literally, our CAS manuals of today don't say Air Force doctrine XYZ. Our Bible for close air support says joint publication 309.3. Everything before the global war on terror, though, there was nothing joint. There was no interfacing between Army and Air Force, Navy, Army, none of that stuff. And in particular, we talked at the early part of the episode, like what came out of Korea before we get into Vietnam. Well, you get at the end of every conflict going back all across U.S. history. We fight a war. Everybody starts to figure out how to work together. As soon as that war is over and the discussion about budgets change, you have 4 stovepipes and they all wear a different colored uniform because everybody's trying to protect their, as you've identified, Joel, their idea of making war because they're fighting now over smaller contracted budgets. And then the war kicks off and it's like, shit. Now we got to figure out how to work together again, right? So the concept of jointness pre-GWAT is an important context I think we need to bear in mind here.
Yeah, I just wonder, is this where I throw out the conspiracy theory that obviously they had seen the French get their asses handed to them by these peasants, right? And they just say, yeah, no big deal. And because this is the conspiracy, wait for it, military-industrial complex needed to keep the war going, right? They're trying out new stuff. They're building new tech. Who's going to pay for it? I mean, what do you think? Is it implausible? That's why the wars keep going, and now they don't stop, right? Around the world. All right, it's tinfoil hat.
No one's disagreeing with you, Conan.
I am also a conspiracy theorist in some regard. So, and I don't think that's too far from the truth. And I think that's kind of what I was alluding to with the Vietnam War. I don't think that people were interested in necessarily winning it decisively or even winning it at all, frankly. I mean, I think they were generating revenue through whatever avenues they were using over there. And I think we do it today. The good news is today, right now, in this particular place we're in, we're using other people to use that equipment. We're not necessarily U.S. people aren't using that equipment. So while we're still kind of doing the same thing, at least now we've learned we don't have to kill our own guys to do that stuff. We can let everybody else kill each other and use our stuff and still make money. So, and Joel, I know you're probably squirming in your seat. You're like, well, this is a little, I'm active duty still. I can't really talk about this stuff. But yeah, if you want to, you don't have to comment on any of this thing you don't want to, for sure. I mean,
I'll make the comment.
I would advise you to be quiet.
Yeah, I'll make the comment about Vietnam. I think, and I'll restrict my comments to that, Conan, if that's okay legally here. No, I think with Vietnam, it would be again kind of important to put that war very succinctly in its context, right? It belongs in the Parthenon of other engagements that are going on during this same period in the grand scheme of the Cold War, right? Like there's so many other tensions and so many other draws on people's focus and desires and strategies that are impacting how we choose to engage in Vietnam, right? So part of this idea about restraint in Vietnam, and JD, you mentioned this, this idea that it didn't look like we wanted to win. I think that I would go so far as to say that, I mean, we're really trying to kind of make sure that we don't draw the Russians or the Soviets or the or the Chinese into the conflict. And so our restraint is sort of built upon that to make sure that this thing doesn't get so unwieldy that actually it turns nuclear, right? And there's a very real concern that actually is really going to happen. And so the idea that we don't want to bomb North Vietnam, that we don't want to invade North Vietnam, I think it's political, but it's a wartime strategy to keep other countries at bay, and recognizing that the real conflict that we're very concerned about is actually going to take place in Germany. The Southeast Asia thing is not really our focus, and so as long as things kind of like if we just stay the course, we keep things kind of de-escalated down here, we let democracy kind of run its course, then it will play out as it should, right? And we know now, again, with the benefit of hindsight, that wasn't necessarily the way that we should have been thinking about it, that was really like the conflict of the time, but it's taking place in a much grander kind of theater that easily kind of gets obscured when we think about Vietnam. And I think it's really worthwhile at least kind of keeping at the forefront of our minds as we analyze this particular war.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not only us, but everybody kind of does that. The Russians aren't wholesale going over Ukraine because they then they know that everybody will get involved. So everybody kind of tempers their amount of, I guess, except for like if we go to Iraq, or Afghanistan, we would kind of do what we want over there. But yeah, a good point.
I'll play devil's advocate here very quickly, and this will appeal to all of us who call ourselves historians. The listeners of this episode should definitely read the book "The Historian's Craft" by Mark Bloch, which the argument he makes in that book, it's easy for us to look back and maybe criticize policy or strategic level decisions because we have the benefit of hindsight. It's also important, and the reason I call out this book is the main lesson from it is, man, we have to remember Johnson, obviously did not make good decisions with restricting and trying to contain the level of conflict that we had to face in Vietnam. But he also made those decisions in the only context that he had. For us, of course, we get the benefit of 70 years of analysis and research later. But at the end of the day, our leaders make decisions in crisis that they assume are the best because they're assuming what the outcomes are going to be. So, context is always important as a historian. So we should always be careful of, I hesitate to criticize historical decisions because it's easy for us 70 years later, if I'm making sense with that statement.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
The Historian's Craft, Mark Bloch. Go read it.
No, you're right, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, it's good. And I mean, I think we brought this up a little bit earlier, specific to kind of the political restraint in Vietnam. Another aspect that's kind of playing out is Johnson doesn't have a whole lot of faith in his Joint Chiefs, and I think he inherits that skepticism, kind of an unnatural level of skepticism from Kennedy, and you see Kennedy's kind of tension with this as we're going through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he sort of develops this way of thinking about the Joint Chiefs that really kind of pushes them off a little bit more into the corner, and suggests that the military way is not the only way, and actually there's sort of like a hierarchy of ways that we choose to engage, and one of those is political, and it should be much higher than a military engagement. And though, like on a diplomatic level, sure, yeah, like always engage in diplomacy before you start shooting. That's a good practice. But at the same time, I think what it leads to is this sort of "I don't trust you" kind of mentality. And so Johnson really inherits that walking into Vietnam. And mind you, same Secretary of Defense, right? McNamara is still very much, a key player in this particular like decision-making process. And they decide that they have to kind of restrain the Joint Chiefs and restrain this military desire to just go like full in. And this is part of what leads.
You mean to win the war?
Yeah, well, and to go in guns blazing, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and so I think he's thinking about it from the context that military can be used for messaging purposes, the same way that Kennedy kind of employs it, which was effective at one point in time. And so why not be able to do this again, right? And so it's a learned historical lesson for him too, that's kind of tainting his process there.
But we also got to think too, right? I mean, this is yes, Johnson comes in the wake of Kennedy being assassinated, but Kennedy was faced with Operation Northwoods. That was a psychological operation, false flag against our own country that was proposed to him by these same Joint Chiefs, right? So even though it was a CIA-run operation, or would have been, somebody had to present it to the president. The president said, "You guys are nuts," and I think that's what Johnson's walking into when he suddenly becomes president.
Yeah, which just goes to show, I think, the impact of these particular things.
Further to your point is what I was trying to get at there.
Yeah, totally.
The thing that pisses me off the most, though, is that we're talking at this macro level, but we forget. We don't forget. The people that were operating at that macro level forget about there's guys on the ground that are just trying to survive. It's so easy to say, well, we were trying to scale it back because we didn't want to invoke what are the Soviets, but it's like all those decisions those guys made to try to manipulate the situation left the dudes on the ground vulnerable, which is near and dear to my heart and everybody here, I'm sure. That I don't care. When a president or a general or a secretary of defense is making a decision that he thinks is good for the greater good of the country, but he's sacrificing his guys on the ground, that doesn't sit right with me. I think there's a way to do both. And I think we have learned that lesson very well over the years. And I think as we've gone, like the GWAT, it purely illustrates that they were like, look, we want to win this thing, but we're also not willing to sacrifice our guys wholesale. I mean, that's I think that's the thing that we're lacking. Even in World War II, I believe they were lacking it there, Korea, Vietnam, and we kind of got out of that later in history. But man, I don't know. It doesn't sit well with me when we start talking about like these higher ups that make these decisions based off things that they think is right, and it's like, well, dude, hold on. Why don't you protect these guys on the ground first? Then we'll worry about all this other stuff. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to kill our own guys. Anyway.
Well, there's a
certain Light Brigade comes to mind.
It's
right.
I love that.
Was that what you going to say, Ethan?
Brilliant. Well, I wasn't going to say that, but he jumps in and it's like, yes, that like applause worthy right there. There's a theory I've been working on in my non-book writing, and I call it. I don't have a name for it, but when I refer to the ghost of GWAT, which is the long-term impact of the war on terror on American society, I use the analogy of American elected leaders, and we'll use a president, the executive officer of the nation as sort of the locus. They have a credit card, for lack of a better analogy, and they get to spend it, and that credit is the will of the American people to support our efforts overseas. And with the post 9/11 wars, it was triggered by the attacks on September 11th. So you had public support, you had an understanding of there's an adversary, we have been attacked, there's retribution, there is global safety. Even going back in Desert Storm, there's the threat, the regional and assumed global threat that Saddam Hussein posed. All of these different conflicts, World War II is the most shining example. It's the idea of liberal democracy versus the rise of fascism. The American body politic can swipe this credit card only so many times when there's a clear strategic outcome to spending American blood and treasure overseas. Vietnam was kind of that first example of, man, we maxed out and spent over the red line of that credit card because there was never an end state while they're trying to balance these very difficult containment decisions. So I always like bringing up that example of the American people are generally supportive of our troops going to war if the cause is just. And I mentioned this on my last appearance on this show is how do we know if a war was good? Well, was it worth going to Arlington Cemetery and reading off the names on those gravestones of was his or her life worth spending in this cause? I think Vietnam is that first time where it's like, man, you don't know, like there's no simple answer to that question. And if it's not clear, you have to wonder, man, should those decisions have been made in the first place? So spending that social credit is always the context of these decisions in history that we need to bear in mind. I'll get better at making that example. I know
that's a great analogy, though, and I thought that was good.
Yeah,
that was good.
That's great. Yeah, and I think pertaining to our discussion today on Vietnam too, it seems like there's a willingness to spend that social credit, which was a great explanation, by the way, all the way up basically, until the Tet Offensive in 1968. And it seems like at that point in time, there starts to be a major transition in the American public's willingness to sort of accept at face value the portrayal of this conflict. Veterans are coming back and saying this was totally different than what people are saying.
Right.
My experience in the field was actually quite horrific. And the tide really starts to kind of turn against the war. And really, I think in that regard, it's like, to use your credit card analogy, the credit limit just got increasingly smaller, right, as a result of what happens in 1968, and which really kind of puts us on a very different path for how the rest of the conflict is really going to carry out. But I think that's a very well explained, Ethan, idea.
Well, and now I'll try to tie it back to what we intended to talk about, which is ROMADs in Vietnam, of course. As we said, there's statistics out there that we've cited multiple times. 70% of the sorties flown during Vietnam were directly correlated to ground support, that close proximity to friendly forces. The prominence of ROMADs coming into Vietnam is because we have all these strategic constraints. The war is becoming increasingly unpopular back home. There are other major force programs that are coming into play. Precision guided munitions made their first appearance in conflict during the Vietnam War at the Dragon's Maw. Now you have to have guys out forward who are able to start fusing all of, number one, these constraints, both strategic, operational, and legal, as well as the unpopularity of the war. It's like, well, we have to start figuring out how to be more precise with these capabilities. We have to have people who can become experts on joint lingo. See how I'm pulling all these tapestry threads together, right? Yeah. The ROMAD concept might have been born in World War II, but it came to fruition as a mature entity in Vietnam. So while the listeners had to bear with us, pontificating about all these things, we're bringing it back together now, right? Like the ROMADs were the quintessential take all these limitations, constraints, bad tools, bad policy, bad operational guidance, and grand strategy. I got to make it work. Ground commander, here's what I can do with close air support. So full circle.
Yeah, and I
Nice.
think what you're talking about, Ethan, honestly, like truly during Vietnam, it's like ROMADs actually develop a little like an institutional identity, right? Or, also simultaneously an occupational identity, right? They kind of figure out, by coming into their own, they figure out what those responsibilities are on the field, and they start to engage those in a little bit more of a kind of a robust fashion, to the extent that I think, the career field maintains some staying power after the conflict because of the contributions during the war itself. And that, this kind of leads us into that, whole separate section of history post-war, because of this, right? And I think, what's interesting, right, is about how that narrative really happens, about how people, make the transition from being this sort of like ragtag group of guys on the ground to guys that really own their craft. There's a lot of different stories about how that kind of comes about, but I think a lot of the aspects of that are driven very much by like the social elements of Air Force culture, and the impact of guys on the ground. To JD's point, like to not forget what's going on with these guys here. Like these guys are going through a lot, and as they're moving through their tours there, I think their lived experience is creating a memory in their mind about how things need to be done in the future and what type of institution they want to be a part of, especially with the guys that loved it, right? So, there's really two examples of ROMAD in Vietnam. Well, maybe three. Number one are guys that absolutely loved it. They just adored their time with the Army. I think they identified strongly with kind of the ground combat type skills. The other kind of side of the spectrum is guys that really disliked it. They hated their time out there with them. They never wanted to go back. They considered it traumatic. Then they want nothing to do with it. And then there's the kind of the guys in the middle that really were a little bit more of they kind of filled the necessary gap for a particular time period. But these guys that really loved it, right? they're the ones that sit out there and set out to make an institutional identity for themselves, and try and define what, the boundaries of this new career field are really going to look like. And that takes shape during the conflict itself. Right now, it doesn't gain traction till afterwards, till 1975, 1976, and then ultimately 77, the career field starts. But during the conflict, those ideas are absolutely shaped. And I think they're shaped a lot by what you're talking about, Ethan, like where guys start identifying with their craft, they start becoming a lot more of an expert at their job responsibilities as well, and then kind of get it in their minds that this is where they want to live, and they're going to make their world the way that they want to make it.
The best part, though, Joel, and I know a lot of your research covers this because you're focused on the social components and dynamics that led to ultimately the ROMAD career field. None of these guys were first round draft picks. Right. As you said, these guys joined the Air Force maybe to avoid the combat experience of being in the military. Like, they didn't join to become forward air controllers or even the ROMAD tier of that capability. So it's a bunch of ragtag dudes who just ended up doing something. They saw the necessity and criticality of their role, and it turned into that black floppy hat we all ended up wearing, which I think is just the most amazing breadcrumb story of a community that can possibly be told. So somebody should write a book about it.
Working on it.
If I could, there's almost like a chicken and egg element to this story, because as we were talking about all the constraints, and it's the guy out there at the pointy end who may be grumbling about all the constraints, and I wish they'd just unshackle me and let me do it the way I want. But the other side of it is that's the nature of the craft, right? The guy with the radio is going to own whatever comes off that aircraft, and so which is taking the lead in shaping one of the core elements of being a TACP, and that is that regardless of the situation, regardless of the context, regardless of the constraints, you're the guy who has to deliver because everybody's depending on you. And especially as we've talked about in the past, so much is falling on this one TACP's shoulders, and I think we see that coming together, taking shape. There aren't enough guys to go around, so we have to rely on ROMADs who had no training. There's all these complicating and even mind-blowing constraints, and yet at the end of the day, I'm the one that's going to keep these guys alive. So I think we see a lot of that we still consider to be core capabilities emerging in this mess, this quagmire that Vietnam is becoming.
So I would like to say that when I came into the career field in 95, 30 years ago, we still had some guys out in the field that were original 275s, right? They came in to be a ROMAD, and our radio operator, maintainer, and driver, and the career field said that's cool, but we're changing, and some of them didn't want to. So further to what Ethan was saying about these guys are, there maybe a couple of them were trying to hide out from instead of going to the military, or to the army. I don't know. It doesn't matter, right? But it's kind of also the guys who signed up for the college money, and then a war kicked off, in 2001. So you had a plan. It didn't work out that way. I'm telling you that I saw some guys who probably should have been offered a way to get out when the career field moved to even further towards what it is today. Instead of just that strict ROMAD, we started getting into an ETAC. We started getting into career progression where you are expected to make rank. You need to be an ETAC. You need to be certified to drop bombs. So, I'm just throwing this in there kind of out of order because of what you said, Steve, but, I really wanted to touch on what Ethan was saying, that yes, it started concentrating, but, it got even more, right? Like it was already, you got to know how to drive, fix, maintain, operate, and troubleshoot, plus read maps, plus whatever, plus, right? That was that. But now it's, you also have to be able to be the person certified to call cleared hot on the mic, because we don't have enough ALOs to go around. So the career field was really progressing, I think, rather than just boom, 77, they are what we are. what I was, not what these kids are going through today. I mean, it's awesome the way they have fundamentally figured out that, like you said, both of you said, Steve and Ethan. I mean, one dude is going to be out there doing all of this. Right. That's why the units have human performance coaches. That's why they have world-class nutritionists. That all this stuff, because they're treated like the Air Force's world-class athlete program. Oh, by the way, they've got to do this other thing too, which is control CAS. That's not what was developed per se in Vietnam, but it was the genesis of that, right? It was the TACP, which people forget stands for party, right? We put the party in the TACP. There's an ALO, there's a TALO, there's all these other different things that go along with it, of which this dude, which we now call a ROMAD or a JTAC, became increasingly more and more, hey buddy, I know you signed up for this, but and I think that's the difference between 77 and where we are today, is just that much more scope creep, right? That much more mission creep, that much more change in the way we use people and things and weapon systems, right? Because the TACP is a weapon system. So I mean, I think there's a long way from we could have easily 8-10 of these between 77 and today in terms of the development of that role as an ETAC or JTAC.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a testament to those guys back then, because we've talked about the difference between guys like us who we said, yeah, I want to be in the military, and these guys from Vietnam and before, they were like, you're drafted now, and you have to do this stuff. And to Ethan's point, they were 304s. They were radio maintenance guys. They would go and you'd bring your radio to them, they'd fix it, and then that'd be the thing. And then now they're like, well, no, we need you to go out here and do it out in the field. And they're like, wait a minute, what's happening? What's going on here? I mean, I couldn't imagine that kind of dynamic change. I mean, it's amazing, and they crushed it. I mean, these guys are amazing guys.
And Conan, you really touched on something there too, and JD followed up on it. JD, maybe we could allocate a few 2 or 3 sessions on exactly that progression from 77 up to today, because I can tell you, as of 2001, we didn't have all those high-speed support elements. We were just, we had tremendous capability, as everybody found after 9/11. But how we progressed from 77 up to what we could do once we had to go in after 9/11, and then the transition, because obviously the pre 9/11 TACP world. We were in so many ways the ignored community, the ignored capability.
Sunset mission.
And then, what's that?
It was a sunset mission. It was going away.
Yeah,
that's right. And then in the career field in the late 90s. I mean,
and then what? Of course, Conan and Johnny Knipe and all the other guys showed them, led to the progression from where we were in 2003 up to where we are now. So. We keep saying that we are laying down a record that our future generations, our sons and our grandson TACPs, can come back and recreate the miracle. Should on one hand, God forbid, on the other hand, I won't be surprised. So much gets lost because of neglect. So. Just my suggestion there.
Yeah, I think we will skin that cat by doing stuff like this. Like just letting people know exactly what happened, and like retelling the history. That's the whole thing. Is like, if you don't pay attention to history, you're going to repeat those mistakes. I can't imagine anybody from, I mean, I say this, but I mean, it happens all the time, but I can't imagine anybody from this point on not taking into consideration what happened, in the past, as far as like ROMAS, JTACs, CAS.
Yeah, we need to get back to grease pencils and acetate. I mean, come on, man.
Right. Joel, did you want to go deeper into any more ROMAD stuff or any JTAC stuff? Like, I think people would be fascinated to hear about techniques. Like, we kind of had our way of doing it. We had it nailed down. We had, publications and regulations and stuff that told us how to do things. But what about back then? I mean, were they trying to how'd they figure it all out? I mean, was it trial and error, or were they like, did they figure it out before and they're like, okay, now go execute, or what do you think?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I mean that's a really great question, and yeah, I would love to talk about that. So uh, it's sort of emphasize this over and over again. That these guys are showing up in Vietnam, right, with nothing, right? They're not well trained. There's an exception to that rule a little bit in the employment of the direct air support flights that were stationed, in Japan and Korea, and basically are funneling out essentially ROMADs and FACs out TDY into Vietnam. But for the most part, most of the guys are all assigned to the TASs, the Tactical Air Support Squadrons there. And like their training routine is not robust, right? It's OJT, but most of the OJT is really learned on the fly. I mean, it really is true OJT. So, most of the guys would come up, they would have like a day or two of transition between, one guy and the next. But the environment that these guys are coming out of are, missile silos in Montana, maintaining radios out there, or I was just talking to one the other day, and he was saying that like he fixed like one radio in a year and a half that he was in the Air Force. And then he shows up in Vietnam and starts doing ROMAD duties, right? So, the context from which they are coming and how they are kind of arriving is sort of a critical transition period for these folks. And what's amazing is that they learn as quickly as they do. So I think they show up, oftentimes and get a whole list of separate duties that don't involve just fixing radios, but fixing Jeeps and deploying with the Army, a number of different things, and a lot of this is all again kind of figured out very much on the fly. The interesting thing is really where I think they start taking over a lot of these close air support roles. And I think you hear really two predominant narratives, okay? And this is purely coming from the oral history vantage point, and just recognize here that, oral histories are always a little bit of a mixed bag, right? Because we've got such a wide variety of experiences, and also, people remember things certain ways. So there's two narratives that at least my research has kind of churned up about what that training piece was like. One, they had, a crop of folks had some really atrocious experiences with FACs and ALOs. And this is, where we get a little bit of our sort of, I don't know, I think like there's like common narratives about this sort of animosity that exists between these two groups of people. And there's stories about ROMADs having to go out with the Army and their ALO and FAC being like down in Saigon because he had a mistress down there, right? And he didn't want to be out there with the Army. So he's going off and doing his own thing. And he's a fighter pilot. Gets to do what he wants. He didn't sign up for this CAS business, so he's going to be away from it. And he can get away with that just because of rank and position. So what that does is that puts that ROMAD very much in this sort of like, catastrophic learning curve where you really have to pick up everything in just one moment. And there are stories of guys having to do those types of things because of those negative social interactions. And the way that they learned it, the way that they picked it up was they heard things over the radio. They, would interact with another FAC in some other capacity and basically kind of figure out some of the language, or they would just kind of get on and just do it. Like it was a matter of trial and error. Then you have another sort of predominant narrative. And by and large, this is the predominant storyline that I hear is that they were assigned to ROMAD FAC teams. So they would essentially operate in teams of two, very similar to like how the JTAC ROMAD kind of concept operated, post-Gulf War all the way through, the early years of 9/11 of GWAT, right? They would go out as a team. The ROMAD would do a lot of the setup and would help, get all the radios going, frequencies, et cetera, would maintain a lot of the comm sheets. and then the ALO would be the one that would basically process the target itself. And the reality is going back to this kind of manpower question, is that the facts really kind of started to train these guys. The team dynamic between these two people was actually really quite impressive. I mean, they, again, talking to folks on the phone, they oftentimes considered these people to be like brothers. I mean, they were just hand in hand. We are in this together. We're figuring it out as we go along, kind of team dynamic. And the fact would start to train the Romad, like out of necessity. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to point out, right, being Captain Obvious for a second, but the reason that you hear these stories about these guys and they're like brothers is because nobody tells a story of the guys who couldn't figure it out. Right.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
A little tip of the cap to our boys who did figure it out, because you got to imagine there were a lot that didn't. That learning curve's got to be like near vertical. Hey, I showed up to fix your radio. Great, get in the truck. Like that's whoa, what? And then I do want you to, if you would, when you're done, if you could, talk about the progression in gear, right? I mean, if they show up with basically boots and a belt and canteen, how do you know how it became kind of institutionalized that if these guys are going to go forward to do this job, they need X, right? Like at one point, that was the Jerk 206, big, pallet, right? Prior to that, that's what I'm getting at. Like, how do they go from, dude, we need you over here, to actually getting fielded? That's a basic set of equipment to do the job. And maybe I've just derailed the whole conversation. I apologize.
No, I don't think you derailed it at all. I think a great question about that particular progression, and I think it's a worthwhile thing to kind of explore. Just to sort of close out the earlier loop about Romads and FACs, kind of the team dynamic, is that the FAC would frequently kind of teach the Romad, oftentimes doing flying FAC missions. So they would carry a Romad in the O1 and the O2 with them, and they would, help maintain radios in the back. And if they knew that there was going to be this major, firefight, or at least they anticipated one, then they would oftentimes carry a Romad in the back, because they would benefit so much from there being another person in there to help kind of manage the radios. So they were starting to pick up a lot of these trade skills doing this type of stuff. So, I mean, they're really getting trained by a fighter pilot in the intricacies of how CAS operates. I think to your point, Conan, about them kind of just, this exponential learning curve. I mean, they don't have any exposure to this stuff to begin with. And I mean, like day two are out there kind of operating, and managing this whole system. The complexities of the system are sort of, they're more built into the radio management piece of it. And the gear aspect of it, not necessarily the system itself, right? So the fact that like these guys had to just jump on the radio and call back to the DASC, the Direct Air Support Center, and call in a CAS mission, and then the ALO it's not cosmically complex, that piece of it, but the radio aspects of it were. And I think understanding how the Army operates, understanding where air power sort of fits into the mix, these are the trade skills that they're really learning from these FACs. Oh man, now I lost my train of thought. So gear progression. I think it's important aspect to remember that these guys are trained in one thing, right? And that is like exquisite radio tech for the time. They're very familiar with it, and so they do know how to kind of advocate for themselves a little bit more in that process. So as things kind of get towards gear upgrades, they're the ones that are out there kind of making specific requests. So, I mean, they start off with the Mark 107, Mark 108 Jeeps, and that's kind of the origin point. And then, all the way up through the Jerk 206, is kind of one big generation of Romads. And they go from, like, here's your hand receipt for your Jeep, go have fun with the Army, to the Romad, or the folks that really tested the Jerk 206 were all Romads. These are the guys that actually kind of put that process together, advocated for that particular pallet, and put that whole mechanism together. But I mean, as far as how it goes throughout the conflict itself, I mean, a lot of it is just like slapping things together at the last minute. So I mean, they I think very much became experts in sort of mixing and matching gear and making sure that, they could make a system work out of, a patchwork of other, items. So yeah, I mean, these are radio maintainers doing exactly what radio maintainers should be doing.
No, I
don't know
fully
if that answered
appreciate
your
that.
original question.
It's great, and you're right, because I don't think there's anybody on this call or probably even watching this that hasn't made things happen, right? Gotten it done.
Yes,
Who's that? Well,
yes.
mine now. That kind of thing.
Yes.
But I mean, I don't want to self-incriminate, but hypothetically, I may have done the same thing, right, just to get the job done. What I'm getting at is, how did that, as a way of living and surviving, turn into a hand receipt for an entire system, vehicle, radios, antenna, tents, et cetera, that is part of the basic issue per ROMAD today, right? That, and maybe that's beyond the scope of your research, and I'm not trying to play stump the dummy. These are the thoughts that go through my head as we think about it, because I remember being a young airman and had to maintain all that crap, and it was like, we need to get the camo nets out. Why? Because we haven't gotten them out all month. Okay. You know what I mean? And you put up camo nets and it's not fun, right? It's just, I mean, it's not hard. It's just not fun. And then you got to put it back.
Yeah.
So my whole point is, at some point, these guys were stealing this stuff because it worked. And at another point, it became, this is what you get. And so that maybe maybe the formalization of that process. If you know about it, that's great. If not, I mean, I'm not trying to derail this down that rabbit hole. Just, it's the thought that pops into my head as I think about all the things that they came out with during GWAT. They said, yeah, but listen, this only weighs 12 ounces. You said, oh, that's cool. No, yeah, well, you got to carry 5 of them. Well, ounces make pounds, and pounds get heavy after a while, right?
I think too is the I kind of think of it as the Marine Corps dimension to this. That is, the Marine Corps is always getting the hand-me-down stuff because their relationship with the Navy. Well, in our period where it was particularly poignant that our priorities were not the priorities. How are these guys? How are they advocating? What is getting approved? What is not getting approved? I think there must have been a good couple of decades between Vietnam and where things actually start coming together in effective integrated systems, where it's just we keep going up to the cook ladling out the soup. Please, I'd like some more. And of course, we get slapped to the back of the room again. Just something else I think might be worth exploring.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, if you remember when I first came in, and Conan, you probably experienced this. It was the Air Force was like, well, we're not going to give you anything. You can get everything from the Army. You go down to CIF, you get canteens, uniforms, or all this other stuff. And the Army was like, well, what are you coming down here for? Aren't you Air Force? Why, so to your point, Steve, we were kind of begging for everything, stealing. Conan, to your point, I mean, it was, and I'm sure it was that way back then, because can you imagine, and this is kind of goes down to the brotherhood thing. Can you imagine, like, 2 guys, a ROMAD and an ALO, they're like, all right, now go out with these Army guys that you probably don't hang out with that often. And they're like, who are you guys? And they're like, well, we need all this kit. And they're like, well, get it from the Air Force. I mean, I couldn't imagine those. I mean, for us, it was even hard. Can you imagine just like just spur of the moment, out of the blue, you're going to link up with some Army unit out in the bush and
let me ask you
this stuff?
Anybody here that operated under the ROMAD JTAC way of life, put yourself anywhere. You're in Yakima and it's 20 below with the wind, and you and your JTAC have to maintain 24-hour radio watch, right? You guys buddy huddle. You get pretty close. And so I don't say that to even put it on the same level as 2 dudes in combat, but my point is, those are some of your best friends. If you go back in time to when you came into this career field, you were working together mano a mano and getting it done. And if something broke and I didn't have it, I hope to God you had it in your ruck, because otherwise we're toast, right? And you count on each other and you do that. And that's in peacetime. I mean, that's in the mid 90s at Yakima. Say nothing about these dudes who absolutely they're going to have each other's back, and absolutely they're going to know exactly what breaks, right? Further to your point, Joel, about, they knew radios, they knew what they needed to replace. So yeah, absolutely, they appropriated it and took care of it and got the mission done. And that we're here because, right, the winners write the story, and our guys lived to pass those lessons learned on to the next round, who in Vietnam got better and got better and got better, and then here we are today. But
Joel,
I
just a thought coming out of what's been said in the last couple of minutes. Just a suggestion for your research. You're doing sort of a social history of the JTAC career field in Vietnam. Are you also planning on doing something about how the JTACs, the social environment between JTACs and the Army that they were working with? Because the Army obviously made it clear that they weren't happy about these Air Force guys constantly coming and saying, "Oh, we need this and we need that," and how did they get along at down at
Sure.
the at the micro level?
Yeah. I think, okay, so I mean, research suggests the moment, and yeah, I am trying to cover that as much as possible, right? And so you can't have a joint operator without talking about kind of the other side of the story here, about how the Army sort of feels about the whole process. Honestly, they actually feel good, right? I mean, recognizing my hesitation there is obviously any relationship with the Army, between the Army and the Air Force, right? Like, we've all experienced this. There's a little bit of a love-hate kind of going on, right? We appreciate the magnitude of impact that you can,
are you speaking
have on the
modernly, or
battlefield.
are we speaking from Vietnam? Or are we speaking modernly? I'm just
Oh, sorry. I'm saying it's
like
it's
today.
similar,
Today,
right?
there's
So I mean,
mutual
like
respect.
today,
Yeah, not in the mid '90s.
well, today
Not in the
there's
mid
a
'90s.
mutual
We would show up, and they would try to put our dudes on KP duty. Like, they did
right,
not understand what
right,
we brought to the fight, right? So I think this
totally.
is just a quick aside, and then I'll get back to you. I think it's that what we talked about earlier, that institutional memory starts getting lost, right? After World War II, after Korea, it was instantly lobotomized, right? Here, it's like Alzheimer's. It took a while. They started to forget. The war kicked off. They're like, oh wait, we remember, and so
And I think, Conan, you bring up another point, which is sort of worthwhile at least mentioning too, is that there's a difference between, periods of like significant conflict. I mean, just like the cultural isms between the Air Force and the Army in peacetime versus wartime are dramatically different, right? I mean, like my own experience in, during GWAT years versus, when things had kind of cooled off. I mean, the Army starts expanding its desires for you to do other things that are far outside your job duties, and it does become, like a little bit less of a sense of respect, But then during wartime, at least, okay, from a Vietnam perspective, a lot of the guys reported that it was at least sensible, right? I think their relationships with the Army were positive in the sense that they were able to deliver what the Army was specifically looking for. And the ROMADs that stuck around, that really started to make an impact in the community, for the most part, identified probably more with the Army than they did with the Air Force. So, I mean, I think that goes to show that, like, at least there's a sense of mutual respect that's sort of, inherent in that particular job at the time. That doesn't stick around. But I think that has an impact on their institutional memory and how they sort of start to choose to craft their own community. Because a lot of the hard skills that these guys start teaching as soon as they get into the schoolhouse, I mean, they're all basic Army skills, or infantry skills, right? I mean, so I think they view these types of things, fieldcraft, as being just kind of the more critical elements to kind of, to learn for a lot of these earlier ROMADs. So I think there is a level of institutional respect that exists at least earlier on. Most of the folks that served there, well, I shouldn't say most, a bunch of them came out not with Air Force decorations, but with Army decorations. So I mean, like there is something there to be said about.
I mean, as
institutional
perverse
respect.
as it might sound, I think GWAT was one of the best things for TACP Army relations, right? Because they very quickly figured out what happens when you don't have a JTAC, right? And so they appreciate that, and they appreciate the planning cycle of it, right? Especially up at command, where it's tick after tick after tick, and they're turning to you and saying, Air Force, what do we have? I mean, they treat the TACP, all capital letters, as an asset now. I think you're right. I think that's absolute, and I think that's the way it should be. Unfortunately, it wasn't, but hopefully, to your point, that doesn't get lost again. I think one of the biggest things that happened for the career field, saying that GWAT was great for it, is the formalization of the entire career field being under AFSPEC war, right? The one where you've got dudes who go through the same schoolhouse and then they get assigned to an ASOC. That's like snapping the tip off the freshly made dagger, right? It's taking a super trained person and putting them in a staff function. I think that those things that are in the rear ought to be the dudes that have been, maybe they're hurt a little bit, maybe they've been in a while, whatever. They want a little stability. They're also knowledgeable. They're also usually a little more calm. Get the new guys that come in, put them right out in the field, and let's go. And that's,
I think a couple of us have to. We got to wrap this up, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
No problem.
It's been about an hour and a half. This is good stuff. The five of us could go all day long talking about this kind of stuff, but there are other people in our lives that are like, hey, what's going on down there? So let's put a pin in it right now. Let's wrap it up for today, and then let's start off the next time with Joel. If you wouldn't mind, maybe. Yeah,
Vietnam
for sure.
Part 2.
I'd like to continue with Vietnam a little bit.
Yes.
And just kind of get maybe more in the weeds about your about their techniques and how they figured it all out and stuff. But
I want to hear more
for now, let's
hear more about the ALO in Saigon. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, that's we'll talk about that offline.
Yeah.
But no, I can't thank you guys enough. This was great, and again, I know we could go all day, but let's pick it up next time. I'll send out a reminder and we'll do it again. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, gents. I'll see you later.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. See you.